Jim Jones, how are you?
Just doing great.
Great. Thank you for coming back. You and I connected, obviously, on Prop 1. You were for Prop 1. I did 3 Prop 1 interviews for it, 3 Prop 1 interviews against it, and then that one debate between Rod and Hiram, which was awesome. Really enjoyed that. But you have a really deep history with the state of Idaho, obviously, as the Chief Justice of the Idaho Supreme Court, as well as the Attorney General. 12 years as Attorney General?
8 years.
8 years. And then
12 on the court.
12 on the court. Perfect. There are a lot of parts of the state. I was speaking with Governor Little just last week. There are so many aspects of the state that I don't understand. Like I just don't. They didn't exist in my former state of California, or they existed really far away, and just things that I don't get. One of them that has kind of popped into my view recently is the concept of a sovereign citizen. Now, again, I have heard. I think there was like some famous court case a year or two ago that was like all this stuff was streamed on the internet. I read the book Under the Banner of Heaven years back, and I think that outlined a degree of it. But sovereign citizens are a movement or group of people that do exist in the state of Idaho and have actually a pretty rich history of coming in and out of popularity or in and out of influence. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think they've been with us forever. You know, you've always had a faction of people that arises periodically that says that, you know, they are their own rulers and that the state or the federal government can't really tell them what to do. And they come in different iterations. When I was Attorney General, there was a movement over in eastern Idaho centered around Blackfoot, where you had a group of sovereign citizens who said, the only law enforcement officer that I have to abide is the county sheriff, and no other official has any say-so over me, federal or state. And you know, that lasted for a few years, and then it just sort of dissipated. We had tax protesters who said, well, I can't be required to file a federal income tax return because I'm, you know, basically a sovereign citizen. They may not have used that terminology, but that was down in the Soda Springs area, and I had to send deputies down there to collect the taxes, and it was kind of a circus. But the government usually won.
Right. Can you walk me back? Like what is the nature, like fundamentally, what do sovereign citizens consider themselves? What's the relationship that they feel they have with the United States, both federally and on a state level? Like, walk me back on this. Like, where did this come from? Or is it sounds like you're saying there have always been groups of people within communities that feel that they don't have to answer to authoritative figures. But like, when did that kind of come to prominence in your time here?
Well, actually, I think it started way back in the Revolutionary War. You know, everybody was fighting for independence from Great Britain, but they all had a different view of how they should be governed themselves in their local communities and so on. And a lot of people didn't want any government telling them what to do, and unless it was a government that they had established. And so these groups have been woven through our history off and on. They rise for a while, and they find out that they don't have the sovereignty that they claim because, you know, you can be put in a slammer for not paying your taxes, and you can, you know, run afoul of the law and be prosecuted if you don't obey federal and state laws. So they come around periodically. We've had what is called the posse comitatus, which is closely related with that. You know, the only law enforcement agency that lawfully exists is the county sheriff, who was put into office by those folks, and they don't have to listen to anybody else. But I think to a degree it is the independence that we sought from Great Britain. You know, we put great store in our independence, and kind of got carried a little bit overboard, and thinking that there's nothing that could restrain us, or that there's no rule that could require us to observe community norms as set out by our elected officials. And so I think it's raised its head here in these last few years in Idaho, and you see vestiges of it in the folks who want to form these informal militias. We've had legislation kicking back and forth in the legislature about allowing people to arm themselves and march around as a militia. And the legislation has come perilously close to passing in the last several years, but it seems to ebb and flow, and we thought it was going to come up and maybe get approved last year, but it didn't.
And I'm sorry, what's the nature of this legislation? Like, what are the details?
Well, there's a statute under the military part of our code that generally deals with the National Guard and so on and so forth, but there's a provision that prohibits informal militias from forming and marching around town with firearms. And that's what they tried to repeal. They said, well, we ought to be able to do this. And it's kind of related to the sovereign citizens issue, but the legislation was proposed by the National Guard because they thought it was something that was no longer applicable. It was superfluous. And it created a big firestorm. People said, oh, you're going to allow armed militias to march around? And it kind of happened in a number of other states, too. I think it's one of those issues that gets sort of air on the national stage, and then it filters out to the states, kind of like critical race theory and all of these other things that kind of filter down to Idaho eventually, and we fight it out for a while and pass a statute or maybe try and fail, and then people move on to something else like diversity, equity, and inclusion. Well, let's go after DEI now. And so it's just one of those periodical issues that raises its ugly head, and then, after a few years, it's gone.
So the ephemeral nature of it sounds like this one in particular is that people, not randomly, but for some reason it becomes in vogue to talk about being able to assemble in an informal militia manner and wander around. What is there statute for like a formal militia, or are like police departments technically formal militias, right? Like what? Because you're saying, well, you can't make an informal militia. It's like, but do we have like sanctioned actual militias that are not police departments and sheriff's offices?
Well, we've got the National Guard, which is a armed militia authorized under federal and state law.
Oh, gotcha.
And then I think there is provision, although it's not something that is foremost in my mind, but I think that you can form a formal militia, like a sheriff's department could organize citizens to go out and do a search and rescue, or to help with some task that is under the supervision of the sheriff.
Gotcha.
Or some elected official who has the ability to put together what we in the previous years would have called a posse to do their various things.
So it's essentially a formalized group of people that have essentially a law enforcement sponsor, right? Like, for lack of a better word, it's like, yes, we are the overseer of this. We're, the administrator, but they are working, somewhat autonomously, but they report to us, something of that nature.
Yeah, it's not something that most people even are tutored about or engaged in, but an informal militia is essentially a known entity, and that is some that has no sanction by anybody in a position to form one.
Gotcha. Now, going back to the idea of the sheriff being the number one law enforcement, is that actually true? Like, our sheriff in Ada County is Matt Clifford, and is Matt Clifford in my life as an American citizen? Is he the highest form of law enforcement that I have to answer to?
No, it's there are several stages now. That people that believe in posse comitatus or whatever other related idea say that that's the end all and be all. You know, the sheriff, I voted him in, and my neighbors voted him in, and that's the only person I have to listen to. But if you go to court, you find out that ain't the way it works. You know, if the city police arrest you for some kind of a misdemeanor offense within the bounds of the city, you're going to have to pay for that. If you get arrested for a state charge on the state highways, or you know, something that happens outside of your local community, you're going to answer for it. And of course, there are federal charges that can be brought against you. You know, this idea has no legal basis. It's just something that people are told. They have some group that comes in and tells them, well, you don't have to listen to anybody. You don't have to pay your taxes. You don't have to do this, that, and the other. And gets them led astray, and then they get in trouble, and the movement subsides for a while, and then years later it raises its head again.
Man, that's wild. I do not think I met anybody or really engaged with this in, again, my former state that had this perspective. And again, I did read the book Under the Banner of Heaven, which I'm not saying is accurately representative of the sovereign citizen movement or of the Mormon Church, but I believe it was something that was referenced in there. I was like, gosh, man, that's a curious thing. It was like, you don't think the rules apply to you, or you're going to self-dictate what rules you feel apply and what agencies you think you have to be beholden to. And just on the authority of you being a citizen, you're gonna say, I don't abide by these things, and I should have the legal backing to do that. I do remember in seeing one clip of somebody that was arguing. It was like some social media clip. I'm not a good person. I do ingest some social media, but there was a disagreement within a court case where somebody was saying, like, you don't have the authority to do this. Like, I can't remember if the term specifically was sovereign citizen, but he was articulating, like, you don't have ruling here. And the judge eventually just said, I have authority to do this. And he was like, bailiff, take him out. And the bottom line came down to, it's like, listen, I have the authority to order these people that will listen to me, that do not agree with your position, to engage in physical restraint from you, and, engage in, like, they could throw you in jail. Like, we can put you behind bars, essentially in a cage. And collectively, the nation agrees that those people have that authority. Now, individuals, even individual groups, can be like, well, I don't agree with you. It's like, yeah, but the masses of the United States tend to agree, right? And that this is the nature of the Revolutionary War that we got into with Great Britain, which is, if you get enough people, right, to step outside, fine. Like, you can take that shot, right? You can see what happens. I mean, obviously our founding fathers did. And the people in CHOP or Chaz of Seattle also tried in recent years to take over a portion of Seattle. Man, that did not work well for them. And they instantaneously set up what they were criticizing other people doing. Like, they set up their own security systems. They set up their own, like, police detail. They built a wall. They were objecting to when he was President Trump's plan to, build a wall at our borders. So it's kind of like, okay, this is the nature, kind of what you were saying. The nature of the Revolutionary War is you get enough people that don't agree that they should be beholden to a set of government restrictions, and they can indeed break away and form their own nation and their own government. Fine. But you need, like, a nation's worth of people to do that, right? Like, that would essentially be it, which is like, look, if you want to secede from the nation, you need a large in-force mass of people, and you need people leading them that are on par with, like, Adams and Jefferson, like, people that can draft up legal ideas that then are better than our founding fathers. Like, that's essentially what you would have to do, right?
Right. And actually, that was tried back in 1860 and it didn't work out so well. You know?
That's true.
But, you know, you've had these folks, well, I can tell you this, that there was a movement at one point to file liens against all of the judges in the state, or at least a lot of them, against their property, claiming they didn't have the authority to control the destiny of people in criminal proceedings in court. And so we're going to file a lien against their property and you know, cause them a lot of grief and distress. Well, that didn't work out too well because the judges then removed those liens and in some instances penalized the folks who were filing them. But, you know, it's all a manifestation of this this idea that, you know, you can do whatever you damn well please and you don't have to bend to society's norms. I mean, if that's the kind of free-for-all that we're going to have, you can't have an organized society with rules that most people agree with.
That's kind of a trip. It is interesting to me that in the little I've learned about this, people attempt to engage in legal proceedings while claiming that the legal proceedings have no grounds, right? It's like if you don't believe that judges have any authority and you don't believe in the legal system that they have that is set up, that they operate within, why would you engage the legal system in that manner? Because really it needs to be, okay, look, I think this guy is wrong. I'm going to get an attorney that can help me interpret and understand what I can and can't do. And that attorney will help me file these things. And if you go to get the attorney and say, I want to file a lien against the judge, then they're like, okay, that doesn't work. You can't do that for these reasons. And by the way, there might be these repercussions if you do that. But then they do it anyway. It's like you're playing in the wrong game. And I'm not emphasizing that people should do anything different, right? Like I don't know anything about these movements or I don't know a single person who considers himself a sovereign citizen. And people can think whatever they want. I'm not part of the legal system. I don't want to be. It's very interesting, though, that these are movements that again, didn't exist in my former state. And now it's like, no, this is a thing. Like you should familiarize yourself with this because you might hear somebody talk about these things. And this is what they mean over here when they say that.
You know, it's interesting because as a society, we have so much more freedom than so many countries across the globe. And, you know, if you ever go to, I went to several Iron Curtain countries when I was a young person, Czechoslovakia, when it was Czechoslovakia, East Germany, East Berlin, Hungary under the communist rule, Czechoslovakia, and you couldn't do anything. You know, you couldn't speak out.
Wait, why did you go to these? You're not going there for the food and vacation. Like you're not going to East Germany because why did you go?
Well, it was to find out just exactly what was going on. When I was, I guess a teenager, and the Hungarians revolted against their communist government, I think in 1956, I followed that very, very closely and read everything I could about it. And you know, we kind of encouraged them to rise up against the communist rulers and then did very little to help out. I thought that was a real travesty. So it really caught my attention. And I wanted to, to go and see what this was like. And did get to Hungary and people kind of spoke. This was in 1964, which would have been 8 years later. And the people that you had guiding your tours would kind of speak favorably of the revolution, but, they knew they could get into trouble. In Czechoslovakia, they must have been much more repressive because everybody was just gloom and doom, and East Germany was awful. But, I mean, it gave you a perspective of what an authoritarian government would look like, and it's not pretty. And, people who want to have a dictator run their country are asking for an awful lot of trouble. I'm not making any comment about any
Sure.
particular situation, but it's an ugly situation, and I think if that happened here, people would look back to the old days when they could do anything they darn well pleased as long as it wasn't in violation of society's rules.
I mean, obviously, I had no idea that you made these trips and had these experiences. I will obviously never have the opportunity to go experience East Germany as it was. If I may ask, there were a lot of things that people were concerned about in this recent presidential election that they drew parallels with, dictatorial fascist governments, such as those, specifically from the communication standpoint, right? Because people have really taken notice of the censorship mechanisms and the propagation of information that just overwhelmingly becomes not true. Like when you find out, when you go through the trail of where that sentiment or where that comment came from, people are like, oh, this is a total lie. Like, that's not what this person said. And it's only because we have these social media platforms that we're able to distribute the information around, and people are, able to see the video or the recording or the actual commentary. Do you find any parallels with those types of things? I mean, obviously you probably were not there for that long, but you're saying, hey, people were afraid to say anything bad. And just in my limited life experience, I can tell you there was an enormous fear of saying the wrong thing. For instance, in 2020, I had started my first podcast. It's not a great podcast, but I had started my first podcast back in Northern California, right at the end of 2019, beginning of 2020. And it was already going when COVID hit. And I was doing these daily episodes on random little ideas, 10-minute episodes on little thought bubbles, because I was still an SAT tutor. So I was doing these funny episodes for my students, which they really enjoyed. And I merged into doing long format interviews such as this with community members that you weren't trying to be heard, trying to bring people together. Again, very, very much like this. But I was so afraid of saying the wrong thing. I think back on it now and it's like, wow, man, you really, you knew what would happen. As a 37-year-old, I had a business in the community, and I realized really quickly, I was like, oh, don't say the wrong thing, because one, the community might turn on you, because the community, there was a large portion of the community that was very, very much bought into the national narrative of what COVID was at the time. And there was also an anxiety that the bureaucratic system might come down on me as my little tutoring business. And again, it's literally just me. It's not like I had a bunch of employees. It's like, Matt Todd University is what it was actually called. But that was something that I experienced. So when you're talking about people, being quiet, we lost a lot of friends over that time frame because we said the wrong thing. Let me give you a perfect example. I have a friend whose wife took the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, got horribly sick, and literally the next week they yanked it off of the market. And if we said anything against that vaccine as she was getting it, even to them in private, it was like this whole big thing. We got into this big argument. And then the second it gets taken off the market, it's okay to be like, well, it wasn't quite ready. She's looking like, what's happening here? So even if it wasn't the bureaucratic machine coming down on you, even if it wasn't the community at large, there was a real selected censorship, just person to person, that you had to be worried about. And seeing that, it's like, I wasn't in East Germany, but did you see self-censorship and in communication in a broader sense as you experienced people there?
Well, I can tell you that in East Berlin, people would hardly even look at you. I mean, they knew they could look at your clothes and tell you were an American. We stand out. And particularly back in those days, they see the Levi's, and in Russia, they would come up and try to trade you out of them.
On the street?
They'd give you an arm and a leg to get your Levi's, but in East Berlin, people did not approach you if you were an American, because I'm sure that they knew that the secret police were watching their every move, and they were watching our move as we went through the city. people had downcast eyes. They wouldn't look at you. There was a tremendous amount of war damage still in those buildings, a lot of damaged buildings. And you could just feel the fear permeating out from these people, and they were destitute, poor, raggedy. It was just a sad spectacle.
Do you worry about any of that here?
Well, you know, if we don't take our freedoms seriously and inform ourselves and understand what the stakes are, you know, you could fritter it away. The problem I see is that there is such a siloed avenue of information that gets out to people. Social media seems to give you a steady diet of the kind of things you watch on your own. And so they don't give you the other side sometimes of the story. And when you only have a limited input of what's going on in the world and what the issues are, you get a really closed-minded view of what is going on and what may affect your future and the future of your family. And it used to be, you know, you had the 3 TV networks. We got our first television in 1954. Up to that point, we'd all gather around the radio and listen to the radio programming, and you'd get a wide range of opinion on those outlets. And I don't see that the media, you know, the network media or the newspapers that you get. I mean, there used to be a proliferation of newspapers across the country and throughout our state, but the viewership of that media online has dwindled to the point where hardly anybody gets access to those kinds of views that might differ from our own. It might cause us to do a little thinking and try to be a little more discriminating in what we believe and what we do. And I think it's unfortunate. I don't know that we have been able to acclimate ourselves to this tremendous advance in technology where stuff is coming at us from every direction, and we kind of tend to get in a silo and get only one side of any particular issue. And, you know, if you're only experiencing one viewpoint on a range of issues, you can be kind of stampeded in one direction, whereas if you had the availability of more viewpoints, you might look at things quite a bit differently.
Yeah, it is really interesting. The changing in communication is just, it's wild to me. And again, I sit around thinking about communication all day, every day, because it's all I do, right? It's like, what's effective, what's not effective. Let me give you an example of how much of a transition we're going through in the world that I can see. There is a law that I'm sure you would know that the county clerks in the state of Idaho, I think it's no later than 14 days before an election, right? So you can do 15 days, 16 days, 20 days, whatever you want, but you can't do 10 days before an election. So it has to be 14 days or more before an election. You have to put out an ad or information in a local newspaper, like the local newspaper, saying, hey, this is the time of the election. This is where you can go. This is all these different things, right? And I found this out recently, and it blew me away because I was like, wait, what? Who even, like, what is my local paper? Who would even know where the paper is? And this used to be an obligatory communication with a function, right? Not just obligation for obligation's sake, but an obligation with a function so that we could participate in having a more informed and engaged populace. Okay, great. Now we still have that law, and it's all obligation, zero effect. Right? It's not functional at all to inform the broader population about where their voting locations are, but it's still something that's on our books. It's a law which has to indicate to me, as I view Idaho as a very pragmatic, functional state. It's like, okay, this was really important at one point. It's not anymore, but it's still a law. There are those types of things that I see everywhere. With different associations, different counties, different individuals trying to communicate, and everybody's scrambling, saying like, okay, how do we communicate with a population that is largely digital media driven and self-selects and curates their own communication, so that they silo, as you're articulating, they silo themselves off from things that they don't like. Like, how do you communicate with them? And it's super complex because you have to find a portion of the population that actually wants to find out things that might be upsetting or run counter to what they want, right? One of the reasons I always have both sides of issues on is because it's really important that if you grab, let's say cloud seeding, okay? And this is a hot thing that I've done a bunch of episodes on, cloud seeding in Idaho. I've had several people on that are part of the cloud seeding operation, that are employees of, let's say, Idaho Power, or employees of the Idaho Department of Water Resource, or water board members that are appointed by the governor, all of these different people talking about cloud seeding. And a certain portion of people have started engaging with that commentary because they are either happy to learn about it or they're, whatever, they're engaging. I cannot get somebody who doesn't like cloud seeding to even come on. And I would like to, because it's important to know, okay, this is what these people of these larger agencies think, and this is what the people that don't like it think. And let's just hear them out. Like, let's everybody hear each other. Maybe we'll have both people in at once. It's like, hey, this is Kayla and this is whoever you are, random person. Kayla helps with the cloud seeding operation in Idaho. Let's just have a conversation. But it's very difficult to one, get everybody to participate, because most people only want to participate in media where they feel like they are going to be received by a group of people that already agrees with them. Right? Like, if I was an anti-cloud seeding person, I'm sure I wouldn't have a problem getting people to come on and talk to me, right, about how they dislike cloud seeding. But because I present both sides, it's exceedingly difficult to get people to voluntarily engage in that kind of communication. It's like, guys, like, I'm not even trying to get you. I just want to know what you have to say about it. So again, it is one of those things where it's like, how do you engage in communication when people are so aggressively siloing themselves with not just participating in cross aisle communication, but also siloing themselves in their habits, because the algorithms know. They're like, hey, look, don't show this person a cloud seeding video. They're not going to watch it. It's like, oh, okay, then they don't see it anymore. Or like, this person really wants to see only pro-life videos, only show them pro-life videos. Don't show them anything about, pro-choice. Don't show them anything about, positive, whatever it might be. Just show them those things. Like, I haven't figured it out. The best I can do is say, okay, well, look, the people that follow me know they're going to get both sides. And even that, people will silo themselves from that. They're like, I don't want both sides. I just want what I want. What a crazy thing. Do you see any way through it?
I don't know. I think perhaps there could be some kind of civics program in the schools that would inform kids. There are so many media outlets out there, and if you're going to have a well-balanced view of the world, you ought to reach out and see what each of them offers. Because I think probably with the old dudes, you're not going to make any headway. They believe what they believe, and they don't want to hear anything else. But maybe if you could kind of light a spark in some of the youngsters to let them know all that's available out there, and that they shouldn't, automatically discount somebody that might tend to be a little bit on the con side of their viewpoint. I know that the kids get information. They don't read the newspapers, but I was surprised to hear my granddaughter talking very knowledgeably about some of the issues that are currently amiss in the nation. I thought, I wonder where she got that. And she got it off of
her phone,
TikTok.
Yeah, whatever. Yeah.
And I'm not sure that that's a reliable source, but I think if you kind of accustom young people that they do have a responsibility to reach out and educate themselves on the issues. You know, so many people go to the polls in, their younger years and even into their middle-aged years, not really having a handle on what issues are at hand in the state or nationally. And, they only start paying attention, if at all, a week or so ahead of the election. It's kind of like studying for your final exams. You don't pay any attention until it's right upon you.
Yeah, right.
And that's really a kind of a poor way to operate, but I think that's the way a lot of folks do.
Yeah, it needs to. The interesting thing about communication that I've realized kind of to this point is, look, you can get mad that people only pay attention the week before. Okay. And plenty of people are mad for very valid reasons. Like, it's not helpful. You're not going to be very well educated and, all these things. But if you know that, you're like, okay, but this is how people function, right? Like, we can be mad at them, but at the same time, this is it, right? So knowing that, how do we engage with them? And one thing that I think a lot of people are struggling with is the idea that you have passive versus active communication that we're going through this broad transition with. For instance, your granddaughter gets a bunch of information about state issues or national issues off of her phone. Okay, that's because her phone is actively communicating with her. She didn't go to a bunch of different states' websites. The website being the passive. It's like, I'm going to post this stuff and I'm going to leave the burden of consumption onto the end user. So they're going to have to find the website. They're going to have to find the section where I'm talking about this issue. They're going to have to read all of this stuff. It's laborious. You don't want to do it on your phone. You have to sit down like at a desktop predominantly. You have this big problem, but that's how a lot of the larger agencies are still functioning. They're like, okay, we're going to just post this stuff for the public to consume, essentially like a newspaper, but I'll do it on the web. And that should fix the problem. But in reality, all of the consumers of information are now just taking this passive view of whatever my phone throws my way. And I can tell you, you probably don't know, but Representative Ted Hill, it doesn't matter, District 14 representative. Mm-hmm. He and I did a bunch of work on his communication last year, because he was engaging in passing very difficult bills. Okay, so one of them was the compulsory language bill. So he was saying, look, we have freedom of speech. So there's no way that somebody should be able to force me to use a specific pronoun that they want. So say I decide I'm a gal tomorrow and I'm like, hey, Jim, you got to call me she. Yeah, you can call me she if you want. But if you're like my high school teacher and I'm a 17-year-old, I can't demand you call me she. And I can't demand that you do that, or I'm going to have you, reprimanded for your employment or fired or something like that. And so that's a bill that, Ted passed. And he was like, listen, you can, if you want to be nice and observe, or if you just want to forget being nice, if you just want to observe my preferred pronoun, you can, but you don't have to. Not if you're a government employee. You're in the private sector, do whatever you want. But if you're a government employee, we're not game for that. So he passes this bill. Okay. I kid you not, a couple weeks ago, I get an Instagram video from a friend of mine who doesn't even live here, who's saying, is this true? And it's a video of a guy talking about Ted's bill. This guy does not live in Idaho. He's botching the entire thing. He's saying it's illegal to use people's preferred pronouns. It's against the law. It's like, that's not true at all. And here people are taken by it. Now, to my friend, I sent him Ted has a bunch of clips on his Instagram account speaking all about this. He's like, listen, if somebody asked me to use their pronoun, I most likely would. I'm happy to be courteous, but the second you say I'm required to do it by law, that's when I have a problem. And that seems like a very reasonable position. So again, to your point about your granddaughter, TikTok can be valuable, but you also have to consider the source of the information, just like anything else, right? It's like, listen, is this somebody representing Idaho that's saying this? Or is this somebody just reporting what they think might be happening somewhere else in the country? And are they putting a spin on it that increases the visibility of the clip? It upsets more people, like the more upset people get, the more it gets shared, all of these things. It's such a train wreck because there is valuable information, but at the same time, you have to be incredibly discerning. So having a civics course over how to be discerning on social media might actually be a great idea.
Well, it could be. I don't know. I think the founding fathers believed that people would take their citizenship responsibly, that they would inform themselves on issues and inform themselves on candidates, like they did. These were political junkies, essentially, comparable to what we have today, people that are actively engaged in politics, but so many people aren't. And I think they figured that everybody would get out to vote. Well, that doesn't happen. They probably figured that everybody would inform themselves on the issues and reach out and get information that would be helpful in that regard. Well, that doesn't happen very often. And with all of the electronic outlets that we have for information, good, bad, and ugly, it's pretty hard to figure out what's what, which end is up. And, I don't know how you can't sit people down and force them to study and vote and all that kind of stuff. It seems to me that the only thing you can do is start out at an early age and say, it's your responsibility to run this country. Now, what are you going to do that? And give them the idea that books and public meetings and stuff like that can be helpful in forming their opinions. I don't know if it'd work, but I can't think of anything else that would. You can't sit people down and force them to read the material coming out of political campaigns.
Yeah, and not only that, you can't force them, and even if you did force them, not everybody would take it seriously, right? It's like high school. Not everybody takes high school seriously, and that's fine. It's none of my affair. People do and they don't. It's just a tricky thing, right? It's likely that there have always been an engaged population that are hyper engaged with the governance of their communities and society at large, and there are populations of people who are just trying to get through the day and feed their family, which I totally understand and appreciate as well. Phil McGrain said something that was actually kind of interesting that I'd like to ask you about. In March of this year, he and I met and we had a great podcast. He actually said that even though he's Secretary of State and he's an election junkie, self-described, he was saying, we actually, in some instances, I think we elect too many people. Like we have too many votes. And he gave me an example of a very, very small county. And he's like, now listen, you have a school board for this county. You have, like an EMS service. You have county commissioners. He was like listed out roughly 70 people. And the county itself has like 1,000 people. He's like, no, look, you're going to end up with people just, there are too many people that need to engage. He's like, then you have city councils and you have mayors and you have all of these different things. I didn't think much of that until I went to the general election vote this year. And we had something like 12 magistrates that we had to agree should stay on. And I was really up to speed on pretty much all the other issues, but I'm like, how am I even going to find out? Like, where do I go to get information about this particular judge? Like, how would I even digest the rulings, take in all the information about what happened, come up with my own determination if the ruling was fair or not? Like, how does that even function in my life?
Well, I've often been asked who people should vote for in the magistrate elections. And, it's a pro forma election. It only becomes relevant when you have somebody who is a magistrate who is acting outside of the norms. I looked at the ballot this year, and I'd been on the court, up until the end of 2016, and knew quite a few of the magistrates, so that I'd be informed if I decided to vote for or against. But I looked at it this last time around in November, and I didn't recognize 3/4 of the people on there.
Well, you did better than I did, because I didn't recognize any of them.
And people ask me, well, who do I vote for? I said, well, I vote for ones that I know, but I rarely vote for ones that I don't know, which is the majority of them, because it's not going to be an issue unless they're doing something that draws public attention and you don't like it. Like there was, when the magistrate system first came into being in the early 70s, there was a magistrate in Cassia County who was not giving adequate sentences to drunk drivers. It was raised in the community, and it was a campaign issue for that magistrate's retention election, and he was turned out. There was another one in Gooding County where a magistrate was regarded as being a little bit less than judicial in his dealings with people, a little arrogant. Several people got unhappy with that. They raised a fuss in the election, and he was not retained. So I think it's more of a safety valve. If you have some magistrate who's acting outside of the community norms, then it gives you an ability to raise the issue and maybe get that person defeated. I think what are more important are the elections for district judges. These are the people that handle felony offenses and heavier duty civil cases, large damage cases, large disputes of some sort or another. And most of those people are not contested in their election. They have to run for re-election under the Constitution. But I don't know if that's the best thing in the world, because people don't really have a handle on how these people have operated anyway.
Right.
But they do run for election. I think that's when we need to do a better job of figuring out how to inform the public about how this judge or that judge, a district judge, or an appellate judge like the Supreme Court or the Court of Appeals has comported themselves and ruled on cases and so on. Doesn't happen unless there's a contest, and that doesn't always get to the nub of the issue, because there's not much you can say in a judicial election other than, I'm a good person, or I know the law.
Yeah, right.
And if you start getting into issues, that's a little bit dicey, because it's in violation of the canons of judicial conduct. So it's a tough thing.
Yeah.
But I think we need to have, if we're going to have judicial elections, there ought to be some means of bringing candidates out to debate, perhaps publicly in the jurisdiction where they're running, or to get more information from members of the bar as to, and often there is a questionnaire that goes out, I think, on some of these contests where people can, people who are practitioners can have their say. But it's a dicey proposition, and most people don't spend the time to figure out who's. Yeah. Luckily, there are not that many judicial contests. When I retired from the court, there was a fairly hotly contested election amongst quite a few candidates to fill the position. The election takes place in the primary, which is a really poor place for it to happen, because only a small percentage of the voters actually can take part in that election. Or they can all take part, but they rarely do. I guess that's better put. But I've become a skeptic on judicial elections. I don't think that's the best way to fill the position, even though that's how I got on the court.
Well, it doesn't mean that in retrospect you think it's the best way to do it. Speaking of, and I wanted to ask you about Prop 1. Now, obviously, Prop 1 did not pass. It was roundly defeated. It was not like a super close thing. I'm not saying that to put you down. I mean, obviously, it wasn't your baby, but you were in favor of it. And fine, like, doesn't matter to me. What I would really like, though, is for us not to engage in this laborious, lengthy process of going over and over and over about the same issue for the next like umpteen elections where, you know, the backers of Prop 1 feel like there's no resolution and things get worse and they bring it back to the ballot or they rework it. It's more of, I think it would be great if we could figure out, okay, look, this iteration of the resolution for whatever the problem might have been did not work. So is there a way that we either solve the problem conclusively now where it's like, okay, but could we just get this thing, or could we, you know, is there a more streamlined solution, or just, okay, how do we move forward without worrying about this in the same way and then having to spend taxpayer dollars and like, let's not have it on the ballot. Let's not have Prop 1 again every single time we can have Prop 1. Let's figure out what the problem is and how we address it with the means that we have access to. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think we have to, you know, kind of sit back and see what we can do. I don't think running Prop 1 over again would be very productive, at least until people start seeing that they don't like the way things are running in the state. The problem is that you have such a small universe of Idahoans going out to choose who will be the Republican candidate in each legislative district. When you have just a small group of people going out in the primary, now granted, a Democrat can register as a Republican to take part in the primary as long as they do it by the end of the filing season for candidacy, which is in March. So you have to, if you're going to take part in the May election that really determines who is going to be elected in the fall, because if you're chosen in the primary and you have an R behind your name, you're going to be there. And you can get that nod to be the elected official by as little as 8.8% of the registered voters in that legislative district. That ain't a whole lot of people. And you exclude all of the independents who are not willing to say that they're Republicans, and all of the Democrats who would like to have a part in making that choice but can't unless they register as Republicans several months ahead of time. So I think another way to address the issue would be to go back to the system that we had before 2012. In 2011, the legislature passed a law saying that the parties could close their primaries. Before that time, for decades before that, you could walk into the voting booth and the workers would say, would you like a Republican ballot, a Democratic ballot, or an independent ballot? And you could take your pick. And it worked rather well. And we didn't have the divisive politics that we have nowadays.
This is kind of what, okay, first off, thank you for that. Understood. What I felt Rod Beck in the debate with Hiram had a reasonable question, which is his observation was, look, we have elected officials to make policy, make legislation, pass laws. And he was speaking to Hiram, he was like, you're asking to change the way we select those elected officials. But the presumption there is that we need to change the elected officials so we change the outcome of the legislative session, change the laws in Idaho. And he asked Hiram, like, what policy do you not like that has been passed? And Hiram, of course, responded, okay, but are you asking me to list all of the policies and bills and ideas that have come forth since 2012? We have like 600 a year. Like, there's no way I could list them all. But I think Rod's point was still standing, which is, hey, what we're talking about doing is a solution. Okay. And the solution, like, we're going through different solutions. Like you're saying, well, we could just go back to the way things used to be. But the question comes back to what problem are we trying to solve? And I'm certainly not asking you like what policies you dislike that have come up, but do you feel that we have started gaining policies or putting things into law that you don't particularly like, and that's why we need a different means of elections?
Well, what I object to is all of these culture war issues that are essentially non-issues. We don't have critical race theory in Idaho, but that is used as a weapon to go after say, moderate Republicans who believe that we need to do something about our scarce water resources, who believe that we need to actually fund our schools and not waste money on school vouchers that will drain money from the education budget and put it into the hands of religious organizations. All of these culture war issues arise because there is an effort under the closed primary to get the most conservative, the most right-wing candidates elected, and it worked. It's worked beautifully. And Dorothy Moon and the Idaho Freedom Foundation has been able to elect one of the most conservative right-wing legislatures that Idaho has ever had, ever since the primary was closed. And I don't think it's healthy. We don't deal with real problems, fixing the bridges and roads and all that kind of stuff, because we fiddle around the entire time talking about banning books and, how much grief can you cause doctors who are trying to treat pregnant women with real life-threatening complications. Let's get back to business. And the only way I see of getting back to business is getting a system where you don't produce the most right-wing candidates who end up on the general election ballot or just stamped into office.
What you're saying right now, I actually think nobody really said, and Hiram certainly didn't say it, but it sounds like what you're saying is, look, because people are trying to out-conservative other people, and because they're addressing larger national, as you put it, culture war issues, that sucks the oxygen out of the room and leaves less time and energy for pragmatic legislation. So it's not even necessarily that the legislation that we're passing, and perhaps I don't mean to put words in your mouth, but let's just say for argument's sake that you're like, look, it's not that I dislike this bill that got passed or this bill that got passed, but what I dislike is the lack of the bill that addressed this problem over here, like our bridges or our roads or our schools, because all of the energy in the session was spent on culture war issues instead of addressing these bills. So it's not even necessarily the presence of a bill that you're like, I dislike this bill fundamentally, and perhaps it is, fine. But it's also, and perhaps even more important, that it's like, but what did it take? What bills did we not get to? What issues did we not get to talk about or address that would have really solved everyday Idahoan problems that never even found representation because everybody was Mickey Mousing with these bills over here? Is that kind of what you're saying?
That's what I'm saying.
Man, what a great, like, nobody brought that up. And I'm not saying it's right or wrong. It's just like, that's an idea that did not find representation.
Well, actually, I did write a few columns
Yeah.
about it, but nobody reads the newspapers anymore.
Well, that's why you're here now. God bless you, Jim. I appreciate it. Yeah.
But, you know, uh, I'll tell you, there's a real issue on child care. You know, that a lot of the child care centers have gone out of business because they can't afford to pay people. And that's what allows women to work. And that's what allows those women to pay taxes. And that's what allows those women to contribute to society. And, you know, if you don't have a place where you can take your kids where they're safe during the working hours, it's a real problem for everybody. But, you know, nobody really has dealt with that issue in the legislature. We had some money set aside for it from the federal government, and we were parceling that out. And then we had to stop parceling it out because we were running short. And now the governor's decided that, well, he can let that money start going again. But why not address that issue? Because it is holding back the employment prospects of women. It's impacting families. It's impacting the kids. Let's solve it. We can do it. We're smart enough to figure it out. A lot of states have. So why don't we work on that instead of trying to force people with kids who have been diagnosed with transgender issues to go out of state to get treatment for that? Nobody's doing surgeries on these kids, but they're giving them medications that are designed based on their doctor's recommendations to take care of the problems. Let's get the government out of that and work on something like making sure that we have our water resources adequately allocated and protected. You know, why do we have to get into these situations where you got a fight that came up in June and it has been raging ever since, and finally the people have managed to figure out a solution? But I would caution you this: what looks like a long-term solution today can be a short-term solution tomorrow and another giant problem down the road.
Are you talking about the water
The water agreement.
Yeah.
You know, those are the things that we ought to be putting our attention on, and that the legislature should be dealing with and figuring, do we need to make some tweaks in the law to make sure that everybody is treated fairly in the water allocation arena? Those kinds of things deserve a lot of thoughtful study. And, you know, I see the legislature running off on all of these different tangents that really don't make an overall difference in how people are able to run their businesses or conduct their lives. You know, and I see it in the Attorney General's office. You know, we have a really important issue facing the state of Idaho, which is the merger between Kroger and Albertsons. This will affect what people pay for gas at the service stations run by those outlets, but more for food, you know, the price of food. And I don't see anybody here in the state of Idaho, particularly not the Attorney General's office, who is getting involved in that. There are 3 legal actions across the country, one in Colorado and one in Washington, the FTC. That's going to make a major impact on what people are paying for groceries and what producers are being paid for their produce. And nobody is paying any attention to that, either in the legislature or the AG's office. And it seems to me that that's something that, regardless of what position you take on the merger or how it may affect either Albertsons stockholders or Albertsons customers or Fred Meyer's or whatever, that's something that we ought to be paying attention to, but we're off on all of these tangents that don't make a hill of beans difference in what people face on a day-to-day basis here in the state in feeding their families and running their businesses.
Do you the transgender medication for kids is I remember when that law there was a law that got passed in 22. Isn't that correct? I remember the commentary coming out from the governor. Well, I don't want to misquote it, but I understand that that's something that you're saying, hey, look, how many people is this going to actually affect, and how many people are going to care about this on a daily basis? And it's like, yeah, look, probably a very, very, very small number of people, right? Very, very small. But that also seems to be a commentary on the philosophical position of Idaho and its governing body, which is a big question for people. A lot of people are moving places that either are, like pro-transgender, do whatever you want with your kids, or, hey, look, you can do whatever you want as an adult with your own body, not like in society at large, but you can do whatever you want as an adult. You can't do this to like 10-year-olds. And so again, even though it's a very small number of people, do you think there's a place in the legislature and the legislative session where we essentially pass bills that indicate a philosophical leaning or a morality of the legislature? Because here's, and I'll be very candid with you and anybody who's listening. I do not like the idea of transgender women in women's sports. I don't. Full stop. I think that is wrong. My wife played D1 water polo. She was captain of the team. She is an incredible athlete. But I also knew the guys that played guy water polo, men's water polo at Cal, and they were monsters, right? And here's a great example. The rowing team that I was on when I was a senior in college, which is a ridiculous proposition, but we reached out to the women's water polo team and we're like, hey, we want to play a game against you. Now, mind you, rowers are not water polo players. There were like 4 of us who knew how to swim. And I was on the water polo team in high school and I was captain. So I was like, all right, I know how to play water polo. I mean, I'm not like a D1, water polo player, but we played water polo with them. And it was this like hilarious thing. It's like they got their team together. We had like our ridiculous warm-ups and like all of this stuff, right? We had a great time. Just, bunch of college kids having fun. But they did not run through us. It was not the kind of thing where all of a sudden we just got like, it was a joke. They're just passing it to you. It's like, whatever, boom. It's like 20-0 or something. It wasn't really like that. And these were unskilled athletes. The guys in the tank predominantly didn't know how to play water polo, but they were like 6'4", 6'5", and 22-year-old dudes who were monsters playing against. I mean, the women were like 150 pounds, 160 pounds. You had no chance, right? So I see that I know a lot of the criticism of the trans athlete laws saying like, this is a tiny portion of the population. Like, you're worrying about the wrong things. But I cannot trust somebody, me personally. If somebody's like, hey, it's okay for trans women to play in women's sports, I will never trust that person again with anything. Because if we disagree on something so fundamental as that, I'm gone. It's like, hey, I won't even trust you on math. You're saying this is the economy, or this is like, listen, we don't agree 1 + 1 is 2 anymore. So I see some of the commentary about the culture issues as being a comment on the philosophical leanings and positions of the Idaho legislature and Idaho as a whole. Do you think that those types of things where it's like, okay, I know this isn't going to affect that many people, but Idaho's just making comment on what its position is in this broader picture of this national fight. Do you think that those things are important to have?
Well, I know somebody whose family has a transgender child, which is affected by the prohibition of giving hormone treatment, which was recommended by the doctor, which is recognized as proper standard of care by a number of pediatric associations. I suppose there's ground for dispute with regard to the sports issue, but I think on the question of whether a doctor and the family should be able to have their wishes carried out with regard to their treatment of their own kids, not in the sporting arena, but just in their own kids. I think it's none of the government's business. The government ought to stand down when some lady who wants a child presents at the emergency room with a serious pregnancy complication and has to have immediate treatment, and they get shuffled off to a doctor in Washington or wherever. Those are things that ought to be left to the family in consultation with their doctor and following their doctor's recommendations. And the government has no damn business sticking its nose in and telling people that they have to do thus and such. That's what bothers me. You know, these folks who say, I'm a sovereign citizen and I don't have to listen to anybody. I can do anything I damn well please. But you, sir, or you, madam, have to follow the dictates of the government. You can't have the treatment that your child wants and needs, and your doctor recommends. You can't have that emergency surgery that your doctor knows that you need, but he's afraid to give it to you because he'll go to jail for a long-term sentence. That's wrong.
You married two real tricky issues. If I may ask you something, and we're having a conversation I was not anticipating having, so I hope it's all right with you. The pregnancy, the women's health care is one that I'm trying to flush out. That's very, very difficult. And I've had David Riley on from Idaho Chooses Life. I've had Susie Keller on from the Idaho Medical Association. I've also had Dr. Megan Casper on, who's an OBGYN. She's a pro-life OBGYN and feels that the current legislation around this definitely needs tweaking. All of these people are coming to the table very respectfully, by the way. And I so appreciate them for doing it, because this is a tricky thing. And David Riley even said, he was like, listen, the Idaho Medical Association, the doctors, they are not these people that just want to like kill all these babies. That's not it. It's very complex. And I so appreciated him for saying that, because these are good people. I think they're very good people, and everybody's trying to figure it out. The people with philosophical or theological leanings that are saying, hey, this is an unborn child and we need to protect it and it deserves the rights of protection under the law. And then, you have the politicians that are trying to figure out legislation they can put in place that the populace will accept and participate in. And then you have the doctors over here that are saying, okay, all of that's all well and fine, but what about these crazy cases of disease and problems? Because the human body doesn't care about what the legislation is or what the philosophy is. The human body cares about things that are, infinitely gray and different and complex, right? The thing I worry about, though, if I may ask you, and we won't have a right answer for this, okay? So I'm aware of that, is how do we deal with the administration of hormone blocking or transgender medication for children in Idaho when we know that there's a portion of people that are now becoming more and more vocal throughout the nation and world that have engaged in this type of treatment, and then as adults turn around and say, that was wrong. I didn't know what I was talking about as a young person, or I had these problems that I thought would be repaired by, this type of procedure. And again, I'm not one of those people. I'm not speaking for all these people. This is the thing. If every single person who engaged in hormone blocking medication or surgery, things of that nature, if every person every single time was like, oh, no, this is it. This was great. And I've lived the last 50 years and this was the right answer. If every single one of those people said that, it'd be like, oh, well, obviously this is the thing to do, right? But that's not the case. And I get very worried about the legalization of something, or the continued legalization of something, where you have adults saying, hey, I was a confused 11-year-old. These doctors told me this thing. I engaged in it or I engaged in the surgery, mastectomies and whatnot. And that was the wrong thing to do.
Let me just say this. There is nobody who testified in Idaho that surgeries were being performed on minors.
Okay, yeah, I'm not trying to confuse the issue.
Not at all.
Wonderful. Okay, great.
Let's
be clear on that.
Let people wait until they're adults to make that decision.
Sure.
And they can make it on their own. And if they make a mistake, fine. If they don't, fine.
Great.
But we are talking here about hormone blockers. It's not going to kill anybody.
Okay, bring this microphone back closer to you. You veered away. There we go. We're talking about hormone blockers, you were saying.
Right. It's not going to kill anybody. And, there are all kinds of medical procedures where families are presented, should this child have surgery to remove this tumor, or should we wait and see if it metastasizes and see if we can deal with it? You will be presented with all kinds of medical issues that affect your child. Should my child get vaccinated, and maybe with the new Department of Health and Education or Health and Welfare back in Washington, D.C., nobody's going to get vaccinated. Should we do diphtheria shots? Those are all decisions that you have to rely on the medical profession, and the medical profession has a standard of care for almost everything. I dealt with it on the court. We had a lot of malpractice cases, and they all turned on whether the doctor was performing with the standard of care for that particular issue. We have to, as a civilized society, we have to live by the rule of law, and the rule of law says that you defer to the standard of care that is medically acceptable in the profession. And the profession says that hormone blockers are within the standard of care. If that changes over the years, then the issue will change. But we have to have something that we can rely on. And, abortion in a medical emergency has a standard of care too. Doctors know that. They know when they can act and when they shouldn't, and they have some discretion. Same with hormone blockers for kids. If the family decides that they want their child to have hormone blockers, they ought to, and it's within the doctor's recommendations, they ought to do that. Now, we have another situation here in Idaho where some people believe that children should not have any medical care. And if they get born with serious health conditions, just let them be. If that is within their religious dictates. And we don't prosecute people if these people, we're talking about the followers of Christ, the faith healers, if they have a child who is born with a serious but treatable condition, let them be and see if they can make it. See if our prayers can make them well. I say society has a responsibility to protect those children. The legislature has decided that they're not going to protect those children. And so those parents can, without any legal repercussions at all, say, I don't want my child to be treated, and the child dies, and there's no consequences. So in that instance, these people who want to prohibit
medical intervention
in transgender cases are saying this is perfectly acceptable. Well, I don't think it is. I think the state has the responsibility of protecting those children regardless of the religious dictates of their parents. So, I mean, it's kind of, they want the people who object to the treatment that families and doctors have decided they want to pursue are not willing to extend that to these other instances. So either it's one way or the other.
You bring up a really good point, which is what's the role of government in this engagement with families and their children. It's not, I have not heard what you just talked about, which is, again, faith healers having freedom to engage in, what they think will cure their child, which is, prayers essentially. I have not heard that be put up against the use of hormone blockers and saying, okay, how come you get to do this and we don't get to do that?
I think
this is complex.
I think the best thing is just to keep religion out of the health and safety of kids. The hormone blockers, I think, are being, prohibited as much as anything else for religious reasons. I'd hearken back to the idea that you render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, and you render unto God that which is God's. Caesar has the authority to set out laws that protect society, and God has the authority to set out religious beliefs and dictates. So, you have the legal realm dealing with the body, and you have the religious realm dealing with beliefs. And if you keep the two separate, I think you can deal with both of these issues and not force anybody to do something that they think is wrong.
Jim Jones, my guy. I so appreciate you coming in today. I appreciate this perspective. You and I do not share the same perspective, but golly, man, look at this. We're just two dudes drinking coffee talking about it. I really appreciate that. I've had you here for well over an hour. Is there anything in particular you'd kind of like to say here at the end? We've covered a lot of different things today. This is fantastic.
Well, I'm just writing a column patting Hiram Erickson on the back for being such an engaged and eloquent advocate for the Open Primaries Initiative, Prop 1. Brian Smith, who is a big dog in the Idaho Freedom Foundation and the Idaho Republican Party, wants to censure him for doing that very thing, for advocating for Prop 1. In my column, I'm pointing out that the Republican Party has used ranked choice on its own here in Idaho and across the country. When the Senate Republicans in Washington, D.C. were determining last week who would be the majority leader of the Senate, they used ranked choice to make that decision. Their methodology was to, of the three candidates, the one that received the least votes would be excluded, and then they'd run another round of votes for the two that remained so that they got a majority. That's essentially what the Idaho Republican Party did in their presidential preference primary, which was a caucus, and a caucus works on that very same principle. The people vote on all of the candidates. The one that receives the least votes is excluded, and you do another round until you get a majority vote. And that's exactly what the prop does.
Yeah, I actually pointed this out during these debates that that's what they did in the city of Eagle during the mayoral elections. Like that's what they currently do, which is in 2023. And again, I'm not an Eagle resident, but I watched it go on. They had 4 candidates. They did a round of voting in November. No candidate got 50+1%. So they dropped the lowest 2, and then they came out with the final 2 candidates and then ran a runoff race in December, and 1 candidate won. That's it. And it was essentially the exact same thing, except again, with the ranked choice voting, it's being articulated as the instant runoff, because you make that vote ahead of time, where you're like, okay, look, if my guy doesn't win, we go for the next one. Yeah, Hiram drove from Rexburg twice to be on this show, and was not insulting, was not crazy. Like, had clear points. I had several people that were against Prop 1 very roundly and had campaigned against it that listened to his episode, and yours, in fact, as well, and just said, there are problems with our current system, and I don't know how to reconcile them. I don't like Prop 1, but I see what these guys are talking about, that the system is not perfect. And God bless him, man. Like, that's great. I don't know. I don't think you said his name is Brian Smith. I don't know Brian Smith. I don't even understand how the censure mechanism works, because Hiram's a precinct committeeman in Rexburg, and it sounds like he's getting censured like in Canyon County or something. This doesn't make sense to me. But, again, I really appreciated Hiram coming out and articulating these things, because, again, Prop 1 didn't pass, but nobody I talked to said, oh, Hiram doesn't know what he's talking about. They're like, yeah, hey, look, he's really clear and he had some great points. Yeah, I don't agree with him. I don't think this is a solution, but like, Hiram had some good points.
Yeah. And here's a young man who's on the Idaho Human Rights Commission. He worked for Senator Larry Craig when he was a younger person. An accomplished lawyer involved in his community. And this extremist is wanting to sanction him, to censure him. You should applaud him for getting involved and being a Republican, but the whole thing is, let's purge all of these people who aren't as extreme as us. My column will also point out that Lori Likely, who was running as a candidate in the Magic Valley, in the district that goes from Jerome County all the way up to Blaine County, the Freedom Foundation recruited a candidate to run as an independent so that she would lose. So the crazies would rather have a Republican lose to a Democrat than to have somebody of a more moderate outlook in the Republican ranks.
I did read about that. Somebody asked if I was interested in doing a show. I'm like, listen, man, I don't know these players. I don't know these people. Interestingly enough, later that week, I spoke with Dean Diamond, who lives out in Jerome, and he's dealing with a Lava Ridge project. I guess his property borders the Lava Ridge 200,000 acre property that's in question. And he brought that up. And I'm like, wow, man, this is wild. But again, I can't get into every little bit. Jim, I appreciate you. Thank you for coming out. You are a wealth of knowledge and history in the state of Idaho. You've worked obviously for decades to help make it the way it is now. So I appreciate you coming out and sharing some of your wisdom.
I'm very glad to do it. Glad to be here, Matt, and I liked your coffee. It's good.
Hey, good. I'm glad. It's I told the governor the other day. He was like, "Oh, this is good coffee." I'm like, "Help me get it here, man, because we have to order it from out of state." Anyway, thanks for coming in, sir. We'll do it again.
Okay, sounds good.